October 1943, Yorkshire, England. The clock in the guard tower reads 3:58 p.m. Sergeant Thomas Whitmore reaches into his jacket pocket and pulls out a small tin container. Inside, wrapped carefully in waxed paper, are 6 precious tea leaves, his weekly ration. In wartime Britain, tea isn't just a beverage, it's a lifeline. A moment of civilization in a world gone mad. What he does next violates every regulation in the prisoner of war handbook. He walks across the compound toward the barracks, where 30 German prisoners sit in rows, mending uniforms and sharpening tools for tomorrow's farm work. They look up as his shadow falls across the doorway. In their eyes, suspicion, fear. The war has taught them that kindness from guards usually comes with a price. But Whitmore simply sets a kettle on the small stove in the corner and begins heating water. The Germans exchange glances. One of them, a former schoolteacher from Hamburg named Ernst Weber, watches the sergeant's hands. They're weathered, scarred from years of manual labor before the war. Farmer's hands. Weber notices the sergeant's movements are deliberate, almost ceremonial. The way he measures the tea leaves, the way he waits for the water to reach exactly the right temperature. This isn't about following orders. This is personal. At precisely 4 p.m., Whitmore pours the first cup and hands it to the prisoner nearest him. A boy, really. Couldn't be more than 19. The young man's hands shake as he accepts the tin cup. He brings it to his lips and drinks, his eyes close. For just a moment, he's not a prisoner. He's not even a soldier. He's just a young man drinking tea on a cool autumn afternoon. One by one, Whitmore pours for the others. The tea is weak. 6 leaves can only do so much. But that's not the point. The other guards have stopped their patrols to watch. Some look away, uncomfortable. Others nod almost imperceptibly. They understand. In a war that's stolen everything else, this small act of sharing is the last rebellion against the machinery of hatred. This wasn't the first time it happened, and it wouldn't be the last. The story begins 8 months earlier. March 1943. Britain is in its 4th year of war. The German bombing campaign, the Blitz, has ended, but the scars remain. Cities lie in ruins. Families are broken. Food is rationed to near starvation levels. And yet, by international law, Britain must feed its prisoners the same rations as its own troops. The same nation that's bombing London, that's killed hundreds of thousands of British soldiers, must now be cared for on British soil. The anger is everywhere. When the first trainloads of German POWs arrive at camps across Yorkshire and Lancashire, local residents line the roads. Some shout. Some throw stones. Others just stare with hard eyes that have seen too much loss. The prisoners keep their heads down. They know they're lucky to be alive. Many of their comrades weren't captured. They were simply erased from existence in the churning violence of the Eastern Front. The camp at Harrogate processes 400 prisoners in the first week alone. They're kept in Nissen huts, curved metal structures that bake in summer and freeze in winter. The latrines are open pits. The food is porridge for breakfast, vegetable soup for lunch, bread and margarine for dinner. It meets the Geneva Convention requirements. Barely. The guards are mostly older men, veterans of the First World War or men deemed unfit for frontline service. They've been told to maintain discipline, prevent escapes, and treat the prisoners correctly according to international law. But the regulations don't say anything about tea. In Britain, tea is more than a drink. It's a language, a currency, a measure of civilization itself. Even in the darkest days of the war, when sugar disappeared and milk became a luxury. The British government made sure tea kept flowing to the civilian population. Churchill himself declared that tea was as essential to morale as ammunition. Every British soldier received a daily tea ration. Every family had their tin of leaves, carefully doled out to make it last. For the guards at Harrogate, their tea ration was sacred. It represented home, routine, normalcy. That first cup in the morning that made you feel human. The afternoon break that gave you strength to finish the day. The evening cup that let you sleep despite the nightmares. These men had lost friends, brothers, sons to German bullets and bombs. Their tea was one of the few things they had left that was purely theirs. So, when Sergeant Whitmore first suggested sharing it with the prisoners, the reaction was immediate. "You've lost your bloody mind." Tom. This was Corporal Jack Henshaw, a railed, thin man from Leeds whose brother had died at Dunkirk. He stood in the guards' break room, staring at Whitmore as if the sergeant had suggested inviting Hitler himself to dinner. The other guards shifted uncomfortably. Outside, rain hammered against the windows. March in Yorkshire is cold and wet, and the war made everything colder and wetter still. Whitmore didn't argue. He just spoke quietly. "They're men, Jack. Same as us. They've got families. Got people missing them back home. And they're here, working our farms, helping bring in the harvest that'll feed our families. All I'm saying is, a cup of tea costs us nothing and might make them work better. It's not about the work." Henshaw snapped. "It's about what's right. These bastards killed my brother. I know they did. Then how can you?" "Because I also know my brother would have wanted me to stay human. That's all." The room fell silent. The other guards looked at their hands, their boots, anywhere but at each other. Everyone in that room had lost someone. That was the thing about war. It took and took until there was almost nothing left. The question was what you did with what remained. Whitmore stood up. "I'm not ordering anyone. But this afternoon at 4 p.m., I'm making tea. If any of the prisoners want some, I'll pour them a cup. Anyone wants to join me, you're welcome. Anyone doesn't, that's fine too." He walked out into the rain. That first afternoon, Whitmore was alone. He set up a small camping stove in the prisoners' recreation area. A drafty barn that smelled of damp hay and engine oil. The Germans were there, 40 of them, sitting on benches and playing cards or writing letters home. They looked up when he entered, wary. Whitmore said nothing. He just filled the kettle from the pump, set it to boil, and waited. The silence stretched out. Outside, a truck rumbled past. Someone coughed. The water began to steam. Finally, Ernst Weber stood up. He was 42. A school teacher from Hamburg, who'd been conscripted in 1940 and sent to North Africa. He'd surrendered near Tunis, grateful to be alive, devastated to be defeated. He spoke decent English, learned from books and BBC radio broadcasts before the war. He approached Whitmore carefully. "Excuse me, Sergeant. What are you doing?" "Making tea. For yourself." Whitmore looked at him. Really looked. Saw the exhaustion in the man's eyes, the way his uniform hung loose on his frame. Saw someone who'd been fighting for 3 years and didn't know why anymore. For anyone who wants some. Weber didn't move for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly and sat down on the floor near the stove. Within minutes, 6 other prisoners joined him. They didn't speak. They just sat, drawn to the warmth and the impossible kindness of it. When the tea was ready, Whitmore poured 8 cups. The first he handed to Weber. the second to a young private who couldn't have been more than 18. One by one, he served them. The prisoners cradled the cups like precious artifacts. They drank slowly, savoring every sip. Some closed their eyes. Others stared into the dark liquid, as if seeing something far away. After they finished, Weber stood and extended his hand. Whitmore hesitated, then shook it. No words were exchanged, none were needed. The next afternoon, Whitmore returned. This time, Corporal Davies came with him. Davies didn't say why. He just brought his own tea ration and helped boil water. By the end of the week, 5 guards were participating. By the end of the month, a dozen. The tea ritual spread to other barracks, other compounds. Guards who'd lost family members to German bombs found themselves pouring cups for German prisoners. Prisoners who'd killed British soldiers found themselves drinking tea offered by British hands. It made no logical sense, and that was precisely why it mattered. The transformation didn't happen overnight. There were still fights, still escape attempts, still the grinding reality of war pressing down on everyone. But something had shifted in the camp. The prisoners worked harder in the fields. The guards stopped seeing them as faceless enemies and started seeing them as individuals. Franz, who'd been a baker in Munich. Otto, whose daughter had been killed in an RAF bombing raid. Klaus, who played the harmonica and had everyone singing folk songs on Sunday evenings. The tea ritual became sacred. Every day at 4 p.m. In barracks across the camp, British guards and German prisoners sat together in silence and shared what little they had. They didn't discuss the war. They didn't debate who was right or wrong. They just sat and drank and remembered what it felt like to be human. In May 1943, a young prisoner named Dieter Scholz received news that his mother had died in an air raid on Cologne. He was 21 years old. He'd been captured in Italy and sent to England 3 months earlier. When the Red Cross letter arrived, he read it twice, then walked mechanically to his bunk and lay down. He didn't cry. He didn't speak. He just stared at the ceiling. That afternoon, Sergeant Whitmore found him. Scholz expected nothing. The war had taught him that grief was private, that weakness was punished. But Whitmore sat down beside him and said, "I heard about your mother. I'm sorry." Scholz said nothing. "Lost mine in 1940, Whitmore continued. "Heart attack. The doctor said it was her heart, but I think it was the war. She couldn't stand what it was doing to people. Used to say the whole world had gone mad." Finally, Scholz spoke. His voice was hollow. "She used to make tea for me every morning before school. Special tea, with honey and milk. She saved it all week just so I could have one good cup on Sunday." Whitmore nodded. "Come on." He led Scholz to the recreation barn where the tea ritual happened. But this time was different. Whitmore used his entire week's ration, all 6 leaves, and made a proper pot of tea. Strong, dark. He added a precious spoonful of sugar from his personal stash, something he'd been saving for weeks. He poured a full cup and handed it to Scholz. "From one son to another," Whitmore said quietly. Scholz took the cup. His hands were shaking. He brought it to his lips and drank. And then, for the first time since receiving the news, he wept. Great, wrenching sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken. Whitmore sat beside him and said nothing. Just sat, bearing witness to one man's grief in a war that had created oceans of it. Other prisoners gathered. Then other guards. They stood in a circle around Scholz. This young German soldier crying for his mother in a barn in Yorkshire. No one spoke. They just stood together, German and British, prisoner and guard. All of them trapped in a war none of them had wanted, and all of them desperate for it to end. When Scholes finally stopped crying, he looked up at Whitmore. "Thank you," he whispered. "Thank you." Whitmore squeezed his shoulder. "We're all somebody's son." The tea ritual continued through 1943 and into 1944. As the war ground on and the Allied invasion of Europe began, more prisoners arrived. The camps swelled. Resources stretched thinner. But the tea kept flowing, shared in equal measure between guards and prisoners. It became the worst, kept secret in the British POW system. Official policy forbade fraternization. Guards were not supposed to form personal relationships with prisoners. But the commanding officers looked the other way. They saw what was happening. They saw that the camps with tea sharing had fewer fights, fewer escape attempts, better morale. They saw that treating men like men, even enemy men, produced better results than treating them like animals. In August 1944, a German officer named Heinrich Müller arrived at Harrogate. He'd been a major in the Wehrmacht, captured during the Normandy fighting. He was aristocratic, rigid, a true believer in the Nazi cause. He refused to work in the fields. He refused to cooperate with guards. And when Sergeant Whitmore offered him tea on his first afternoon, he spat at the sergeant's feet. "I don't drink with the enemy," Müller said in perfect English. Whitmore wiped the spit from his boot. He looked at Müller with something close to pity. "Sweet yourself, Major. But the tea's here every day at 4 p.m. if you change your mind." For 3 weeks, Müller sat alone while his fellow prisoners drank tea with the guards. He watched with contempt as grown men laughed and shared stories. He saw it as weakness, collaboration. But he also saw something else. He saw that the men who participated in the ritual stood straighter. He'd worked with purpose. Had something in their eyes that he'd lost somewhere between France and England. It was Ernst Weber who finally broke through. Weber approached Müller one evening after work and spoke in German. "You think you're being loyal. You think refusing their kindness makes you strong. But all you're doing is making yourself smaller. The war is over for us, Heinrich. Whether Germany wins or loses, we lost the moment we were captured. The only question now is what kind of men we'll be when it ends. Will we be men who remembered their humanity? Or men who let hatred consume everything that was good in them?" "They killed Germans," Müller shot back. "They bombed our cities. And we bombed theirs. And they're still offering us tea." Müller had no response to that. The next afternoon, he sat down at the tea ritual. Whitmore poured him a cup without comment. Müller held it for a long time before drinking. When he finally did, something in his face shifted. Not surrender. Not defeat. Just exhaustion. The exhaustion of carrying hatred for so long. "Thank you," he said quietly in English. Whitmore nodded. "You're welcome." May 8, 1945. VE Day. Victory in Europe. The war is over. In London, crowds surge through the streets. Churchill addresses the nation. Church bells ring across Britain for the first time in 6 years. At Harrogate, the guards and prisoners gather in the main compound. They've heard the news. They know what it means. There's no celebration. No cheering. The prisoners know they'll likely remain in camps for months, perhaps years, while Germany is rebuilt. The guards know their brothers and sons will soon be coming home. Some of them. The others will never come home at all. Victory tastes like ashes and relief mixed together. Sergeant Whitmore stands in front of the assembled men. He's aged a decade in 5 years. His hair is white. His hands shake slightly. But his voice is steady. "Well," he says, "it's done. The war's over. God willing, the madness is done too." He pauses, looks at the prisoners, looks at his fellow guards. I don't know what happens next for any of us. I don't know if we'll remember these years with pride or shame. But I know this. Right here, in this camp, we did something the war tried to make impossible. We stayed human. We shared what little we had. We looked at each other and saw men, not monsters. Whatever else history remembers, we should remember that. Then he pulls out his tea tin. "So I think we should have one last cup together. For those who didn't make it. For those who are going home. And for the world we're going to have to build." They brew the largest pot of tea the camp has ever seen. Guards contribute their rations. So do prisoners who've been saving leaves for weeks. They mix it all together in a massive cauldron borrowed from the kitchen. It's weak, barely enough flavor to color the water. But when Whitmore pours the first cup and passes it to Ernst Weber, who passes it to Corporal Henshaw, who passes it to Dieter Scholz, who passes it to another, and another, and another, until every man in that compound has drunk from the same vessel. That tea tastes like something else entirely. It tastes like hope. The prisoners were repatriated slowly. Some returned to Germany in late 1945. Others stayed until 1947, helping rebuild British farms and infrastructure. Many stayed in touch with the guards who'd shared their tea. Letters crossed borders for decades. A few prisoners even returned to Britain as immigrants, settling in the very communities where they'd once been captive. Ernst Weber became a teacher again in Hamburg. He never drank tea without thinking of Sergeant Whitmore. In 1963, he traveled to Yorkshire and found Whitmore living in a small cottage near Harrogate. The two old men sat in Whitmore's garden, drinking tea, speaking about their families and the world that had changed so much. "You saved my life, you know," Weber said. "Not from death, but from becoming something worse than dead. You showed me that even in hell, humans can choose to be human." Whitmore shook his head. "I didn't do anything special. Just made tea." "No," Weber said firmly. "You did everything. You proved that the best part of us can survive, even when the world is trying to kill it. That's not nothing. That's everything." Dieter Scholz settled in England permanently. He married a woman from Leeds and opened a bakery. He never forgot the day Sergeant Whitmore used his full week's ration to make tea for a grieving prisoner. He told the story to his children and grandchildren. He told them that hatred is easy, but kindness, real kindness, the kind that costs you something, that's what separates humans from the machines of war. Heinrich Emil Müller returned to Germany and became a professor of history. He spent his career teaching students about the ordinary people who resisted hatred during the war. Not through grand gestures or heroism, but through small acts of decency, sharing food, offering kindness, seeing the human beneath the uniform. "I was saved by a cup of tea," he would say in his lectures. "Not from prison, but from myself. From the poison of ideology that would have turned me into something monstrous." One British sergeant showed me that the enemy was not the man across from me, but the hatred between us. A Sergeant Thomas Whitmore died in 1979 at the age of 73. His funeral was attended by dozens of men who'd served in the camp, both guards and former prisoners. They came from Germany, from across England, from as far as Canada and Australia. They came because 35 years earlier, one man had decided to share his tea ration with the enemy. At the funeral, Ernst Weber gave the eulogy. He spoke about kindness in dark times, about the difference between following orders and following conscience, about how the smallest acts can echo across lifetimes. Thomas Whitmore was not a hero, Weber said. He would have hated being called that. He was just a man who understood something fundamental. That our humanity is not given to us. It's a choice we make every day. And in a war designed to strip that choice away, he chose it anyway. He chose to see men instead of monsters. He chose to share instead of hoard. He chose compassion when revenge would have been easier. Weber paused, his voice breaking. He chose to make tea. The congregation sat in silence. Outside, rain fell on the Yorkshire hills, the same hills where prisoners once worked and guards once patrolled. The war was long over. The camps were gone, converted to housing estates and business parks. But in that church, for a moment, the past was present. After the service, the former prisoners and guards gathered at a local pub. Someone produced a tin of tea leaves. They brewed a pot, using the same method Whitmore had taught them. They poured cups and passed them around, just as they had decades earlier. They were old men now, grandfathers, pensioners. But in that moment, they were young again, back in that camp, drinking weak tea and remembering what it felt like when someone saw you as human in a world gone mad. The story of the tea ritual at Harrogate was never officially recorded. It doesn't appear in military histories or academic studies of POW camps. There are no photographs, no official documents. Just letters, diaries, and the memories of men who lived it. In the grand narrative of World War II, it's a footnote, a small thing. But perhaps that's the point. The war was built on grand narratives, nations and ideologies and sweeping movements of history. Millions of men fighting over inches of ground, entire cities reduced to rubble, cultures and peoples nearly erased. The scale was overwhelming, the horror incomprehensible. Against that backdrop, what did a cup of tea matter? Everything. Because the war was fought with tanks and bombs and bullets, but it was survived on acts of kindness that refused to be extinguished. A guard sharing his tea ration, a prisoner saying thank you, a group of men, supposedly enemies, choosing to sit together in silence and remember their shared humanity. Those acts didn't change the outcome of battles. They didn't shorten the war by a single day. But they changed the men who participated in them. They became proof that even when the world demands you hate, you can choose otherwise. That even when ideology insists on division, humans can find connection. That even in a prison camp in Yorkshire, surrounded by barbed wire and armed guards, people can create moments of grace. The tea ritual taught something the war tried to destroy, that our enemies are human, that humanity is not conditional, that the person across from you, regardless of uniform or nationality, or what atrocities their nation committed, is still a person, a son, a brother, a father, someone who laughs and grieves and fears and hopes. To recognize that doesn't mean forgetting justice or accountability. It doesn't mean pretending the war didn't happen or that crimes weren't committed. It means understanding that healing begins not with revenge, but with the radical act of seeing each other clearly. Today, there's a small plaque in Harrogate, placed by the local historical society in 2005. It commemorates the POW camp that once stood nearby. Most people walk past without noticing. Those who stop and read find a simple inscription. Here stood a prisoner of war camp, 1943-1947. May we remember not just the conflicts that divided us, but the humanity that united us. Below that, a smaller line. And may we always share the tea. It's a strange memorial for a war camp. No mention of battles won or enemies defeated. Just an acknowledgement that humans were here, and they chose kindness. Every year on May 8th, a few elderly men and their families gather at that plaque. There are fewer each year. Time is undefeated. But those who come bring thermoses of tea. They pour cups and pass them around. Guard descendants and prisoner descendants. British and German, all of them children and grandchildren of men who once saw each other across barbed wire and chose humanity. They don't make speeches. They just drink their tea in silence. And remember, because in the end, that's what survived the war. Not the hatred, not the ideology, not the grand narratives of nations and armies. What survived were the small acts of kindness that humans extended to each other when everything else said they shouldn't. A cup of tea, shared between enemies in a camp in Yorkshire in the darkest years of human history. That's what endured. That's what mattered. That's what it means to be human in a world that tries so hard to make us less than that. And sometimes, on quiet afternoons when the light slants through the windows just right, if you sit very still and pay attention, you can almost smell it. The faint aroma of tea brewing. The ghost of kindness that refused to die. The proof that even in the depths of war, compassion survived, one cup at a time.